This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 19, nearly got it wrong. My name's Andy and I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
And we're starting what we think is going to be 3 episodes on the topic of prayer. And this episode is going to be about, can God actually do things in the world? Why doesn't God do things in the world? Does God have any power? Is there any point asking God things? Stuff like that. But I wanted to briefly sidetrack onto why are we talking about some kind of abstract theological topic when we're supposed to be a podcast about justice. But I was listening to a podcast with Steve Chalk on it this week, and I thought he put it really nicely when he said people asked him why he goes on about dogma when he's all about acting, and he said what you think affects how you act, and I think that's a good explanation. And then we were talking about it earlier, and Leah said, what did you say, Leah?
I said the story we tell ourselves is the key to how we live, and theology is the story. Well, good theology is the story we tell ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that's come up quite a few times in this podcast, that the story we're telling ourselves is, we're trying to figure out what story we are telling ourselves, and and I think that's a really good explanation. Thank you, Leah. All right, so as I said, tonight's topic is the beginning of talking about prayer, and starting off with the kind of most direct, straightforward questions about what's the point, why doesn't it work, stuff like that. So shall we start off? Oh well, let's start off with our homework. And I believe, Jörg, that you've done the homework. Is that right?
I have, yeah, and
Well
it wasn't a totally last-minute thing or anything. So the homework we set ourselves is to tell a story from our lives of like either freakishly answered prayer or some sort of unexpected situation, just an answer to the question, can God work in the world? And I guess for me, the thing that came to mind immediately was, I think at that point I was already studying theology, and my whole way of thinking fell apart. Like, God was less powerful, the Bible wasn't simply true in the way it used to be true, I needed to find new truths in it, and the whole question about God acting in the world had also come undone for various reasons, which I hope we'll explore more later. And I was riding my bicycle in my hometown of Leipzig in the middle of the road, and I had gone into a lane. I was waiting in a traffic light, gone into a lane that I thought I was going to go off to, turn around, left.
You're on the other side of the road.
It just messed up my left and right. So I was basically, it was a 2-lane road veering right. I wanted to go left, so I was in the left lane of this and next to a car, thinking that everybody in that lane was going to go left. So the light turns green, and all of a sudden the freakish wind blows against me, and I just can't start like I normally do start, rather sporty, or did that then, I guess. And then this car overtakes me, and I realize my mistake, that it was going to go right. And I'm like, sort of thinking, oh great, I was saved or something. And then immediately thinking either then or later, no, that couldn't have happened. Like, God doesn't act in the world like this. He can't save.
So he blew you
people
on your bicycle so that you didn't move into the path of a car. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Suddenly a great wind rose up
from veering into the and it was really weird. It was really a freakish gust out of nowhere. I mean, it was sort of an autumnish day, but it was completely still. And the moment we took off, it was this weird gust blowing in my face, so I didn't get hit by traffic. And it just didn't match my theology anymore. It was just this weird thing of an unexpected happening in the world that my mind immediately read as, oh, God saved you. And then like, no, wait. If you can't do this for people in airplane crashes, etc. You can't expect it to be here. So
Yeah. Yeah. Goes to the heart of...
So my homework brings to light all the conflicts
Yeah.
of the topic, rather than being a testimony to God's acting in the world.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been out of keeping, wouldn't it? Leah, what about you, Leah? Do you have any things like that?
Well, I did the homework because it didn't involve much doing. It just involved a quick bit of thinking. So that was that's easy. Because actually, I have loads of stories of what you might call God incidences or little coincidences where God's answered prayer. And I'll give you one quick one, which was I think I must have been about 17, and my heart was broken by some guy, and I was really, really miserable and doing that teenage angst thing like only teenagers can do. And I went outside. I think I was at a Christian conference. I went outside and I sat on the step outside this building, and it was August, so I do admit there are a number of these happening in August. But I said to God, God, if you really actually love me, then let me see a shooting star. And there was a shooting star. And I don't think I've actually seen very many in my life, but that was one, and it just appeared out of nowhere. So, yeah, right at that moment. Slightly random.
Yeah. Something sort of similar happened to me when I was a teenager, and I decided that I wasn't going to be a Christian, and then I'd decided that I was, or I decided that my problems with it had now been resolved, but I was very, very reticent about getting back into the whole thing of just feeling guilty all the time and being miserable. So I didn't want to become a Christian again. And I went on a Christian holiday camp, which is where these things always happen. Mm-hmm. And one of the leaders kind of said something like, there's someone in the group that needs to the kind of thing that someone would say when they'd realised that I was in this position. So I decided that I was going to sort of, test God. So I went to a room where there wouldn't normally be anyone around, and I said, if my leader comes, this leader who said this thing, if they come into the room before the next bell goes, then you obviously do exist, or you obviously do care about me. And then the bell was late, and they came in just before it went off, and it was a huge shock to me. I really wasn't expecting it to happen. So it's similar to Leah in the sense that it was okay, God actually does care about me type moment. So it was very important to me at the time, but when I relay the story now, the same questions arise about why is God bothering with that, and then not bothering with stuff that's just so much more important. And then if Esther was here, she'd say that nothing is more important than God healing the relationship with you, right? So,
I have an
maybe
Esther
she's
one,
got
actually.
a point. Yeah?
Much more. Yeah, I have a much more recent one. So it was a few months ago. I had this really, really vivid dream, and in this dream, I prayed for Esther, our vicar, and I prayed for her leg. That's really weird. I woke up in the morning and I thought, oh, okay, maybe God was saying something to me, so I prayed for Esther's leg, and then I thought, I should maybe tell her, but no, this just seems a bit weird. No, and then but by about 3 days later, I finally got around to it, or spoke to her about something else, and it came up. I said, I explained the situation. And genuinely, she had a problem with her leg that got fixed on that day when I prayed for her leg after this dream. And it was a problem I didn't know anything about. So there you go.
Therefore, God exists.
Therefore, God exists.
I'm glad we've sorted that out.
We're done here
at the
then.
beginning.
Okay.
Yeah, so our work is done, really.
Cue the exit music.
Ta-da!
Oh wow, this is our most cynical episode ever.
Oh, but the problem is, if it wasn't for these stories, I would have so much less of an issue with prayer.
Yeah.
I know I'm kind of leaping ahead maybe, but if I could just relegate prayer to being something that happens between me and God and is some kind of meditation that changes my outlook and changes my frame of mind, and that's all it ever was, then it would be easy. But then God is kind of annoying, because there are these times that we do really feel point to God answering prayer, And then that just leaves you with this massive gaping question as to, well, if he can stop Jörg being blown off his bike or knocked off his bike by a car, what about all those other people that could have been saved?
Yeah. Is that one of your worries?
That is me launching straight into my worry, yes. Yes, the injustice of it, if we're talking about justice. If this God can act and change things and make things better for us, then why doesn't he do it for everyone? And I bet there are a lot of people, going back to yours and my first story, Andy, I bet there are a lot of people who feel they got to a crisis point and asked God to reveal himself to them and nothing happened.
Well, that is a really good question. I'd be really interested, listener, if you're probably not listening, if that happened to you. But if you are, I would really like to hear that story.
And then we figure out why God loves you more than them, Andy.
Presumably, if it's not obvious.
Yeah, I mean, talking about my worries, I think I'm like one worry further down the rabbit hole than Leah, because it's exactly those questions of God's presuming. I don't want to say God's presumed injustice, but rather the fact that the idea of God's love and justice isn't easily reconciled with the state of the world. That led me, for reasons we can explore if we want to or not, to believe that God isn't capable of doing anything in the world, because otherwise I couldn't reconcile it with that, other than through humans. So like I have much less of a problem with this youth leader of yours coming in because he was listening to God. So I can make that work in my mind, that if people listen to God, he communicates with them, they come together, that's fine. But God actually sort of intervening in the course of the world to save me from getting knocked off a car, which probably wouldn't have even been fatal. And yet others who are in a much more precarious situation receive no such help. That just doesn't work. So that leaves me the question, if I'm left with this God that steps aside so something can appear next to him, and that something is then simply governed by natural laws, how then can intercession work? Like, what am I left with to pray for? What am I left with to pray like? That's my main worry. Intercession doesn't make a lot of sense other than calming my own inner anxieties, listen to God, readjust my feeling toward others. In that therapeutic sense, yes, but not in the I'm doing this in order to get God to move on something that he would probably think is a good thing, because otherwise he wouldn't do it, but he needs my prayer for him to do it. Sorry, that was just a lot of stuff rolled in one. But
yeah, the central question is, it can't possibly make sense that we influence God. Or that,
I mean, it's really two questions. Can he do it? And if he can, why does he need us to prompt him? Like, I mean, these are both two extremely difficult questions, and they're much easier if you say he can't. He can only set people right who want to listen to him. But that leaves us with a pretty flat God that I realize not everybody's happy with. I'm not even sure I'm happy with it, but I just haven't found a different answer.
And Leah, do you agree with me that is not the God that we read about in the Bible?
Well, the God that only ever acts by prompting other people to act.
And he doesn't really listen.
The people who wrote the Bible are pretty clearly convinced that God acts unilaterally in freakish ways in the world.
Yeah, but also in response to prayer, right?
And also in response to things that people ask him to do, yeah.
And we talked, when we were discussing this, about, I think, both Moses and Abraham, who appeared to persuade God of different things at different times in the Bible, right? Change God's mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And I read a really, really good thing the other day, which you're going to just have to talk for a minute while I find it, because it was... It was really
you looked like you wanted to say something anyway.
Go on, so you'll go.
I always
don't go off that topic though, because
it's my default
actually no,
face.
I found it. So I'm going to read you this before you change the topic. So you're talking about Moses and Abraham possibly changing God's mind about what they were going to do. So this thing I was reading said, Abraham was different from Noah. Noah was a simple, obedient man who failed to stand up to God and argue for the lives of the people of his time. Abraham, by contrast, was not blindly obedient. He would stand up to God in the name of justice and compassion.
Oh, Noah was a company man, huh?
Those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. The justify those that died, they're the chosen whites.
See, I have no problem with Abraham and Moses because their God just threatens to do something that he actually doesn't do. So it's just a test for them. They intercede, they say, don't be like that. What will the other people say? What will the other gods say? Don't do that to yourself. And then God says, okay, cool.
But
You've done what
what
you
if they
needed to do.
hadn't? What if Noah should have stood up and that's why we had the flood?
Well, he didn't, and the what ifs don't really work. I mean, like, that's not a problem for me. Like, a much bigger problem for me is the stories of, like, you know, people needing to hold up Moses' hands. So, you know, he prays to God so that the battle would wage against, was it the Edomites or the Midianites? I don't quite remember. And then the battle kind of wages back and forth, and every time Moses forgets to pray or weakens in prayer, it just turns the other way. I mean, that just seems to be, yeah, that's all the problems rolled into one, isn't it?
Can't
Well,
that
that's
also be
also-
a test?
And that's also God kind of happily killing people just because Moses was lifting his hands up, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He influences the battle directly, and he needs Moses to hold his hands up because that's how it works. Because God otherwise doesn't know what to do. Like, it has all those problems right there.
Or it just doesn't show that the people cared enough about it. If Moses wasn't bothered enough to hold up his hands, then why should God be bothered?
Perhaps, I don't know. Yeah. Okay, sorry, we plunged right deep into the worry and into the rabbit hole. But Andy, you haven't told us your worries yet.
Yeah, I mean the same stuff. Like, so I have, I think maybe I sit in a third place from both of you. So what I'm hearing from you, Jörg, is like this stuff can't make sense, so I have to try and find a way of dealing with it. And what I hear from you, Leah, is like I can't make sense of it, but it seems to be here despite the fact that I kind of can't understand it. I think where I sit is like, it obviously doesn't make sense, but it feels right to me to demand of God and to accuse God and do that thing of, come on, God, you can't be like this type thing. I have a friend of mine is seriously ill, and a group of us meet regularly and pray for them, including praying, you know, like, please make them be better, which I have no reasoning for or explanation of how if God did that it would be right, let alone any faith that God will do it. But it still sort of feels like something that I should say, like because of an honesty of it, or because of this thing of just saying, look, this isn't how the world should be, and
it's
so why
something
are
you
letting
should.
it?
It's something you should say because you require it of yourself, not because other people require it of you, right? It's something that comes internally that makes you feel you should say it.
Yeah, I mean, if I
It's
think
not just because it's the dumb
if
thing.
I thought someone
in
was
Christian-
telling me to
No, I'm just
do it,
thinking.
I would definitely not want to do it.
Yeah, well, that's just you. But I'm just thinking some people I think there's a strong pressure in Christian circles to feel that there's a burden on people almost when terrible stuff happens, to feel you must be diligent in prayer and you must pray for this, and then you get into very dangerous territory about whether you've got enough faith to make it happen or not. And so I just wanted to clarify, really, that's something that comes from you and how you feel, that you feel you have to cry out to God about it. Is that what you
Absolutely. And I think I really, really struggle with that thing that you were describing. I was thinking about the book of James, and I've been thinking about it recently because of the whole... I'm trying to re-understand the whole faith kind of doesn't exist if it's not exhibited through action thing. But James also says this stuff about, essentially says, you should just, like, if someone's ill, you should just pray for them and they'll get better, and leaves no door open for any of a lot of our own personal experience of that not happening. And the only door left open is that you've failed, to have enough faith or to be diligent enough or whatever. So I really, really struggle with that. If you're trying to defend the listener from something I said making them feel like that, then please do, because I didn't mean you to feel like that, listener.
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, isn't it? I mean, in my own life, close relative who died of cancer had taken on this faith theology this last months of his life, and he asked us to have faith with him. And that was hard. That was a hard request. You could see him deteriorate. You could see him make the wrong choices toward medicine. And yet he was like, and we're saying, I wish you well. Don't wish, declare. And you're like, oh God, I can't do this. Like, I understand that that's your choice, but it's very difficult for me to stand in there with you. And I know why you're doing it, because that is what keeps you sane. That is what upholds you, that hope. That's what makes you hopeful. And I just can't share it.
That's hard, man.
Yeah, that goes in many different directions, I guess. But I mean, shall we... this injustice thing still bothers me. Like, okay, great. Maybe we should trust that God sometimes does it, and then when he doesn't, it just has no explanation. That only works up to a certain level, and then when you see, like, grave injustices... I earnestly prayed for peace in Ethiopia from the same kind of spirit that you come from, Andy. Not in a sense like I can really expect something to happen, but really crying. And yet, that very night, several people got slaughtered. And then I should believe that without me praying, God prevents a stupid mistake and sort of directs my life, by letting a wind blow against me, or I can pray for, I don't know, a small ailment to be healed, which might even go away by itself. Taking, Esther's leg, for example. It's that discrepancy. Once that gets to larger levels, I just can't square it.
Yeah, so I've definitely met people who've gone through awful experiences and have come out the other side saying the only way I can make sense of this is that God doesn't act at all, because otherwise the conclusion is God chose not to act in this situation. Yeah.
And that's where I ended up in my studies when I wrote. This was like in my third year or so. So bear in mind that was like the whole course would have been about 4.5 years. I wrote I wrote a paper on theodicy, so a long study paper. I read Leibniz and some others, and all about freedom as well. And I really loved the freedom argument, so God only intervenes when it doesn't interfere with other people's freedom. But then you say that and you're like, hold that up against the Holocaust, like Hitler's freedom was more important than that. Why can't he then get cancer or something? Like, why can't there's other ways of making that problem go away. So I just ended up in this place where I just couldn't, I had no argument left. And incidentally for me, it was also, that was where my whole theology shifted. And there's an amazing Jewish philosopher, Hans Jonas, who wrote a little tract called Thinking of God After Auschwitz. And he falls back on Jewish Tzimtzum philosophy. So it's a sort of Kabbalistic speculation, what would have happened in the beginning of the creation. And the idea behind it is that because God, if we want to depict God as an all-powerful being, there's nothing that can exist outside of him. There's nothing that can exist against him, in opposite to God. So in order for there to be a world, God had to retreat within himself. He had to create space that was God-free so that there could be a counterpart to God. And that's where the universe comes in. And in that at least for me, helped me to hold those two distinct. So in that sense, God is still there for the world, talking to the world, engaging with people in the world, but no longer with the power and the ability to do things directly in the world that are not coming through his creation. So that's I feel like from the theodicy point of view, problem solved. Intercession point of view, it's like completely gone, or a new problem emerges.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you. Now you're under control. Now you do what they told you.
Yeah, it just doesn't fit with what everyone in the Bible is talking about, right? Like everyone in the Bible is, asking God to do things, and God is responding, and God is interacting in ways like striking people dead because they didn't donate all their money to the church. And
So we're pretty stuck. That's a good dead end. Okay, so I have some non-answer answers.
Good.
So these are my non-answers. That God is about relationship. Is where I start with the answer to that. That Andy's response to the situation with his friend is the right response of somebody that is in relationship with God. Now, kind of whether God will do anything or can do anything or should do anything is kind of by the by to the relationship that God has with Andy and Andy has with God, and that's where the prayer comes from. And if we see God as person and not it, not machine, not computer in the sky, not something that follows a set of rules, then we have to live with these inconsistencies and these total bewildering mysteries. That's my very poor beginning of where I start.
Yeah, through the things that we've been talking about, both before we started recording and after, there's this feeling of, are we not taking this massively individualistic and like mechanistic causality worldview, that even if like you have a fundamental belief that the world is mechanistic, you still have to admit that it can't really be understood in those terms all the time, because it's too complicated. And so if we accept that God is a person and that God understands things that are completely beyond our understanding, maybe it helps us to stop demanding that God acts like a computer with input and output that we can predict. Maybe.
But where does that leave our idea of justice? Because justice has that universal tinge to it, doesn't it? So has God just forsaken his people sometime because he was just too disappointed with them? And that's where the theology really gets difficult, because when you then try and trace out what that means for God's justice, and then vice versa for what happens in the world, you can find yourself in a place where you say, well, yeah, God has chosen to take this person, God has chosen to keep this person, God has chosen to put this president in power, and sometimes that president, and here we are. So, I get that relationship point in the sense of you crying out for your friend, and I think that's where intercession is essential, but the expectation that comes toward God in it, and of his acting in the world, I still can't square it with the thought of justice. Even if I don't think of God as a computer justice, right? I'm not saying always the same output.
I definitely think if if what I'm saying leads you to a kind of, God moves in mysterious ways, and we shouldn't question how the world is, then I want to just throw away what I said, right? Because the model that I want to follow is like when Abraham's saying to God, "You wouldn't do that. You're a good God." And so actually, Abraham is completely willing to judge the world and say the world should be like this and should not be like this, and God should act this way and not that way. So if what I was saying is kind of making you think, well, we can't understand God and we should just accept things, that's definitely not what I'm saying. But we also But
yeah,
just, I guess having
that,
expectations of God is not the same thing as believing we can predict God.
yeah.
Because just because we have an idea and we think God wants us to have an idea of what justice looks like, it doesn't mean we know what that is in every single individual circumstance, does it?
But we also shouldn't assume that the expression of the world is God's justice. So
Absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah, that's...
So in that sense, I guess it still doesn't work to say, God knows what he's doing kind of thing, and therefore sometimes he answers prayer.
I don't think I really mean that, no.
So I'm very much with you, Andy, in this sort of rebelling sense. I really like that. I really like that sort of, come on, God, if you're out there, this is not what should happen. This is not how it should be. If you're doing this, you need to think again. That I really like, because it is actually demanding justice. And that, I think, is an important aspect of intercessory prayer. It's just the expectation bit in answer to that prayer that I have trouble. Like, articulating it is great. I think it's important because the alternative to that is just, well, the world is the way it is. The strongest will win, the weakest will lose. And in the end, maybe God will come toward us. Maybe it just all goes and dissipates in heat death. It's that cynical view of the world. So that kind of intercession, this is not how it should be. It should be coming toward God. He should be intervening now. That rebellion I really like. I just don't know what outcome to expect.
And does that matter?
I don't know it does, yeah. I mean, I have an affinity for punks. Like, you just rebel for the heck of it. I mean, it's fine.
But Leah, I'm reminded of what Esther was saying about the theology of the fall, and then the lack of expectation that people are going to act well. And I guess we also shouldn't have an expectation that the world is going to act well, or think good things are going to happen, right?
Not sure I would say that it's not always going to be well. Some things are infused by the good work that God is doing in the world, and some things are definitely not. And to say that it will always go badly because of the fall, I wouldn't agree with. Is that what you were saying?
No. I guess not being surprised when things go badly or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question for me is, how much influence does God have over the systems that humans create? And those systems are often the thing that keeps us all trapped in the injustices of the world. So is it okay to limit God's power in that sense and say, well, God isn't just going to strike down and pull apart those systems that humans have created? The outworkings of the way we've set the world up are happening, and that a lot of the things that that are unjust are the result of the way humans have chosen to structure things.
I mean, that's essentially the free will argument.
Yeah, it's a different version of that.
A different version of it, and I mean, there's two counter arguments. One has nothing to do with the free will, and that's, well, there also seems to be an inconsistency on the natural world, natural side of things. So you can see a shooting star when you need it, but a person who's dying of cancer doesn't get the necessary intervention. And both of this have probably nothing to do, if we're not assuming that all cancers are caused by pollution. Nothing to do with human injustices. But the other thing, and that's what I was saying earlier, if God has the ability to act and he chooses not to, then he becomes culpable in the crime. So it's like if you're, yes, you want to watch your child grow up, but if they're seriously starting to self-harm, you have to stop them from it. You have to talk them, bring them away from the cliff edge or whatever. And to stand back and say, no, that's your free will. You can push your sister down that way. That just isn't, that would be, you would be complicit in the crime if you did that, if you had the power to stop it. And that's the real killer argument for, against the free will thing when you get to the kind of atrocities that we seem to be able to inflict upon one another. If God has the power to intervene, doesn't he also have a moral obligation to intervene?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like God is like an extremist libertarian, if that's the way he interacts with the world, right? Like like there's some compelling reason not to intervene in these cases where.
So God is a small government guy. That's good.
Yeah. So speaking of God not acting, the thing that I think of when I'm thinking of God not acting is Job. And I really, really love Job because I see the plot of Job being like a clear demonstration that the world is not just. There's this narrative of if you do bad things, the bad things happen to you, which is just completely destroyed by Job. And then I see the ending where God says, you shouldn't question me, as actually God admitting that there isn't a good answer to Job's questions. And Job says things like, I wish I could take God to trial, and things like that. And then at the end, God says to the friends, he says, you haven't spoken of me what is right, like my servant Job has. So if I combine those things together, what I feel like is happening in Job is that God is admitting that the world is unjust and that he has some responsibility for that. I know I'm putting a lot into that, but and that I love Job for that reason, because I do think God is entirely responsible. God could have just not made the world. And so God is responsible for the suffering that's happening in the world. And I believe that God did that because it's worth it. And sometimes when you look at some of the suffering, you think, how can that be?
Yeah, that's the other really difficult argument. Again, that this is where Hans Jonas starts. Like, you can say that thing maybe up until the Holocaust, but after that it gets really, really difficult. And I don't even think you can say it up until that. I think the exceptionality of the Holocaust...
It's just because it's most recent, but there have been all sorts of...
Yeah, and it has its own problem in that it's always then the standard example, and then we just devalue those lives lost yet again because they're now just some theological mass.
Trolley problem. Yeah.
My gosh, yeah. But I don't think God actually says that. I think God just evades. He just says, you have no standing in this court, Job. And he blasts the friends for... I mean, the story is the friends just kind of, all except Elihu, who got praises, but the other friends just kind of want to find a fault in Job and say, well, look, even if you think you've done nothing wrong, even if we can find nothing wrong, we know the way the world is. It's always just. If you've done something wrong, you get something wrong. If you've
it's just
done
a very simple equation, which, by the way, we didn't even talk about. I guess we've sort of dismissed that out of hand, that idea that you just get what you deserve.
Well, because the Bible is already done with it by the time Jesus rolls around. It doesn't work for the people of Israel either. Like, you have all these big empires around you that just keep bashing you. I mean, how many defeats can you take until that answer is just no longer working?
But yeah, I think that blustering argument from God, I think that is him admitting, I have no answer for you.
Yeah, I can get behind that.
I feel on the surface... No, I'm struggling. There's a part of me that wants to feel that the suffering is worth it if God. No, what am I trying to say? There's a part of me that feels it can excuse God's bigger plan that I don't understand, and that the suffering is worth it just so that people can have free will. But there's another part of me that feels that's incredibly cold-hearted.
Mm-hmm. And this is, but this former answer is exactly the route the Bible takes in Job, right? And this is why this is probably the biblical answer. We can't figure out. We're not supposed to figure it out. God himself evades the question.
Mm.
So Job gets this unique opportunity to see God. I mean, like that's just, or to hear God out of the storm, right? So, I mean, that's not something that everybody in the Bible gets. So Job gets this unique opportunity. He finally has his moment in court. And all he gets is this amazing, overwhelming sense of this thing is a ton bigger. I just don't get it. I don't get the universe. There's lots more going on than I understand. Sorry, I put my hands over my mouth. I spoke too soon. And that's all the Bible gives you. And I find that on the one hand, it's fine. Like you can say, okay, this is enough to live your life. You can just go away with that and say, you don't get it anyway, so just give up. But first of all, I don't know what I mean when I say God is good, God is just. Like those things start to lose meaning because of that immense puzzlement. And then also, how are we to make sense of why prayer sometimes appears to work and sometimes it doesn't? Like it just creates so much turmoil. That answer. Yeah. And maybe that's right, but I'm just saying it just doesn't solve anything unless you just want to walk away and stop thinking about it.
But why does it make it lose meaning? It doesn't for me. It doesn't for me. It just.
Well, what does it mean God is good if that goodness of God can mean that sometimes millions of people die and sometimes millions of people walk through the Red Sea?
Mm-hmm.
What do we mean? What do we mean God is unchanging when these things happen? What does it mean to talk about good?
But
so
you know the answer, else you wouldn't be asking the question.
No, I don't know the answer. I gave you my answer. I find it more comfortable, and I know that, and I'm not satisfied with that answer, but I find it more comfortable to think of God as somebody who comes to suffer in the world. That is the Christ. So God who's unable to do something in the world, so that when he comes to us, he even has to suffer death. He even has to let himself be hammered on the cross. That's God's witness to us, that he has really given the world over to us.
Mm.
And that's why I find that Jewish philosophy, where God condenses in order for something to appear next to him that can be held accountable by him, I find that theologically a lot more convincing, but it leaves me with an incredibly weak God that can only act in the world by people who care about God listening to his instructions.
Is that weak? Or is that just a God that wants to be in relationship with us?
It doesn't enable me to pray, God, can you heal this person's cancer? I can't. That doesn't, because he doesn't do that. But
I'm really glad you brought up Jesus and the Christ, right? Because there's exactly where the mystery lies, and that's where something that's maybe the most important thing for us to talk about. That if God has limited his power in some way that maybe would be open to rational understanding, God has also engaged in the world in this completely absorbing way, like the whole of creation, in the Christ, that is like the opposite of being disengaged, right? It's like the world is shot through with God, but that doesn't mean that God is controlling these things that we are kind of wishing that
it's the opposite.
Control.
God.
So what does it mean? It's just some mystery.
No, but God submits himself to the world.
Right,
if you are the Son of God, you will step down. You will step down from this cross, and he just hangs there. So if that's our witness, then we're actually left with a God that lets, and that is also the comfort in the sense that that God, that's why we say he's with us in our suffering, not in this sort of vague spiritual sense. He can also somehow feel it. No, he has felt it. Because he's made that room for the earth to exist, it's now part of his story. He's made that room for something to exist outside of him. It now afflicts him. Because if it was inside of him, it wouldn't afflict him. He could get rid of it. But now that it's outside of him, it afflicts him. So that's why, like, theologically, I can put this together. There are real problems, as you guys rightly said, with the biblical witness, especially parts of the Old Testament, the sort of very immediate response to prayer. And there is the problem that certain prayers are just very difficult to say from that theological point of view. But it gets rid of the problem of the evil, and not the problem of God's justice in light of evil.
But that joining of God and that submission of God to our world is like a mystery, basically, that is part of, like, at least one of the mysteries that we need to accept is outside of our understanding. I also wanted to say, on the thing of like balancing up, should God have made the world given that all this suffering was going to happen? I also feel like that is just way beyond. There's no way we could begin to try and answer that question. You know, if we were talking about what we were talking about last podcast about like the intrinsic value of people, and you know, we don't understand what the value of, you know, the creation is, and therefore what it's worth going through for. And you know, God went through it, as we're talking about. Sorry, Leah, go on.
I'm going to say you have 3 children, don't you?
I do.
Who you chose to create. I'm assuming. Let's not go into that, but you know, there's a something there, isn't there?
There is something about like choosing to participate in something that isn't always comfortable or whatever. But as soon as you mention children, you then are back into why are some people suffering such awful things happening to their children or whatever, and that immediately just throws me into why is everything so bad, or why are some things so bad?
Well, in some way, our procreation is also just participating in that life force that somehow seems to exist, that just pushes things along. So like, how much is that really a choice, or is just us participating in something that happens, and in some ways that reflects the goodness of God, because he let this happen, he let this thing come forth in which good and bad can happen. So I think I'm at peace with that from my comfortable position. Wow, that's really cynical, I guess. Hang on, I have to finish this. But like I was going to say, I'm at peace with that from my comfortable position, as long as I can keep God, as long as I cannot hold God responsible for it. And why is that cynical? People who suffer tend to do the opposite, and probably rightly so. And maybe that gets us back to prayer. They're not at peace with where they are, and they are holding God responsible for that.
Yeah.
Right? So from my comfortable point of view, I just have a theological problem watching other people suffer. But when you're going through it, you have an existential problem, and then it's not so pretty to say, well, yeah, Tzimtzum, God just made this world in which these things happen, and he doesn't have the power to intervene. And then we come back and we cry, no, help us, save us.
Yeah, and then you act more in line with what the people in the Bible do.
Yeah. And I think it is good to come back to that and remember that a lot of the Bible is written from the perspective of a downtrodden and a marginalised people, right? So we sit here as the subjects of the empire.
We don't tend to pray for the death of our enemies. The
dying empire. So, yeah.
Some would say a dead empire. But
yeah, I'll give you that. Dead empire. Yeah, right. I'm not going to argue with that one.
Yeah.
Still living off the fruits of the empire, let's put it that way. Yeah, anyway, so that was a bit of a digression. But the Bible is written from much more from the perspective of people who are in the situation that you say, and so it wouldn't be human if they didn't cry out to God to change stuff, right? That's relationship with God.
Some of those that work forces.
So is then the idea that God can do stuff in the world and our practice of intercession ultimately just a rebellion against reality and our aspiration toward God's world, toward God's kingdom, like we said? Is that where we're left? I mean, I think I'm comfortable with that theologically. It's just harder to have that really existential when you then in the end believe that it doesn't.
But we have also talked a lot in this podcast about God, something from heaven coming towards us. Mm-hmm. So are we just chucking that out now? Is that not? Is that not something we believe in this week?
Oh, boy.
No, but I think when I brought this up, and I did bring this up a lot, it's the image of God has created a world in which unexpected things all the time happen, and that's the beauty of it. So sometimes you try and have a peaceful revolution and you get shot down, like in Tiananmen Square. And sometime later that year, you try and have a peaceful revolution and the government collapses. Mm-hmm. Leipzig.
Yeah.
And that's great. Is that God doing it? Once I get to that level, he didn't love the Chinese yet enough to take the yoke of communism off of them, and they had to grow in a different way into capitalism. Like, it just doesn't. Then I'm like out. But to say, wow, isn't it amazing that we live in this world where the new is always possible, where the unexpected comes, and I can even say thank you for this world, if I don't have to believe that God is programming each event. Just the ability of events, that's maybe what he programmed.
So it wasn't heaven coming towards anyone in Leipzig, it was just the luck of the draw? It was just a historical circumstance?
It was a taste of heaven, because heaven is the belief that this world in its events has ended. There's no longer development. I don't want to bring it back to the contentious debate about time. But, dear listener, that's an inside joke. But in the sense, when we see those events happening, when the unexpected, the good, suddenly comes out of nowhere, we're reminded of our faith in a salvation that will catch us in the end. And that's what our image of heaven is.
But I feel like we're just missing a massive dose of I don't understand it, but this is what I've got to do. So, like, before we started, we were looking at verses like this one in Lamentations that says, "He's walled me in so I cannot escape. He's weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer." That's Lamentations 3:7-8. And, like, the point of that prayer, and by the way, that very chapter also has stuff about, and yet God kind of comes to me in things. But that verse is not about, like, I have a well-rounded understanding of how God interacts with the world. It's about, I am in a relationship, like they were saying, I'm in a relationship with God, and I'm angry.
I think I'm just, I'm not as good a philosopher as Jörg. I'm totally happy with that. And I am content to think of myself as, we've all had toddlers. I'm content to think of myself as a toddler petitioning my parents who love me. And if you try to ask a toddler to explain the rationale behind when their parents gave them stuff and didn't give them stuff and did what they wanted and totally ignored them, you'd get quite an interesting muddled set of ideas. But isn't I'm probably totally ridiculous.
Well, you turn out psychotic if your parents give you all the toys and beat up your sister, lock her, and break her legs
exactly.
and
I'm
log her
probably
over,
like ridiculously simplifying this, but I'm content to be the 1-year-old or 2-year-old that sometimes smashes my feet on the floor and says, "Come on, God, what on earth is going on here?" In an expectation that sometimes, in a way that totally bewilders me as to why they're doing it now and they didn't do it half an hour ago. God acts, but I can see that's far too simple for you guys. But
we have to, in order for that to work, we have to accept a level of lack of understanding in ourselves that is massive, right? Because when you see some of the things that happen in the world, they are so far beyond what any good parent would not allow to happen.
I know.
So that's where you struggle.
Yeah.
And it kills off the question that you rightfully ask. That's why I like Andy's Rebellion. When something like that happens to people and they say, why? Then
That's
you
right.
give them a massive shrug of the shoulder and say,
No, I don't.
God
I stamp
knows.
my feet. I'm that toddler who stamps
You're
their feet
being
and
the
says,
toddler,
"What
not
is?"
observing
Yeah,
the toddler,
I'm not
yeah.
observing the toddler. I am the toddler. I stamp my feet and say, "Come on, Mum, do what you're meant to do. You're meant to be my mum. You're meant to be good. What the chuff's going on?"
And I think the danger that we face as people who think of ourselves as adults is that we lie to God and to each other about how we're content with what God is doing in the world. And we say, "Oh God, if it's your will, blah blah blah." But by the way, that prayer isn't always wrong, obviously. But if we don't mean it, and what we actually mean is, "What on earth are you doing?" Then the evidence I see in the Bible is that when people say that to God, God appears to love it. In fact, all his favourite people seem to be people who say stuff like that to him.
Mm-hmm. So a
Maybe he doesn't
broken
have favourite
theologian
people.
like me now sort of sits there and says, okay, I can get behind this idea of intercession. That is the toddler rebellion. I even like that because it keeps me in the world. It keeps me invested. It keeps me not cynical. I still hope every time somebody asks me to pray for their cancer, I still go through the same intensity of pleading with God. Help. You ought to do something. And that's fine. But in order to do that effectively...
But now you're going to destroy my whole analogy bit
No.
coming.
I'm just saying where my dilemma lies in this. In order for me to do that effectively, I need to believe that that's possible. And it's at that point I have to cut off my thinking, because if I am to believe that that's possible, then I am left with all the other moral questions about God. So at that point, I just have to say, stop it, you're Job, God has just called you out, you know nothing. You know nothing about how this world works. Stop thinking about it. Perhaps. But again, then the question of goodness and it just really cuts off a lot of thought right there. Maybe for the better, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we don't have to say stop thinking about it, but don't let the thinking about it stop you doing this thing which you think is right, even though you can't make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, the toddler doesn't necessarily have to say a toddler, right? The toddler should be growing up. The toddler should be asking the questions. The toddler should be trying to make sense of it all.
But then the toddler develops theories about why mommy and daddy sometimes give and why they don't. And those theories
then they grow up into
make
complexes,
the toddler manipulative and
neuroses.
and cynical. When
Yeah, but some of those theories turn out to be right? Some of them turn out to be about, certain times of the day they get food.
But I can't even get one theory that's right.
No, well, you haven't grown up
about
much
these
yet.
things.
That's all.
But we definitely we can't abandon the idea that we have something to say about what's right and what's wrong, right? We have to be humble and understand that we'll sometimes learn, and the human race has certainly shown that learning about what's right and what's wrong over time, I think. But we didn't do that by abandoning the idea that we can understand what's right and what's wrong. We obviously don't understand everything. We don't understand the way that God is somehow engaged in the world and also allows things, or whatever the right phrase is. But we still have something to say about what's going on, is what I'm trying to get at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And we still...
Okay. I'm following you into the rebellion. I'm not sure I'm ready to go beyond that. Because, again, there's just a lot of assumptions about how God interacts with the world that just leave me in philosophical and theological quandra.
Yeah. Is that the plural of quandary?
I don't know. Quandary. What's the singular? Is it quandrum? Then it would be
Quandary
quandra.
and quandaries, I think.
I think we've had two classic Justice Warriors moments. One where Jörg interrupted himself to contradict himself earlier, and now Quandra. Amazing.
That's just my linguistic ability.
Your linguistic ability is impressive. We are just, as native English speakers, struggling to know whether what you said was right or not. That's all.
All right, so we try and end our podcast by talking about an alternative vision of the world. Have we done that yet?
No, we're all toddlers. Is that it? I know. I'm sorry. I know it's weak, but it works for me, and it pushes me into a relationship with God. And
I think I have a vision, and that's a vision that can keep the intensity alive of rebelling against history while also accepting it. So that's that sort of Job vision. And I don't even need the sense of sometimes God sends a lightning bolt from heaven and takes care of a problem by healing someone or taking out someone or whatever. Just even the sense of, even though I know the world is sometimes unfair, I'm still looking for fairness, I'm still looking for justice. That we bow down to the world like Job did to God and say, I've spoken too soon, I don't understand it all, and yet we don't lose that intensity of the rest of the book of Job that still asks that question. And
I feel like as Leah raised earlier, that thing that you talked about lots of times, Jörg, about the sense that heaven is coming towards us, or God is coming towards us in the world. I feel like we shouldn't lose that as well, even though we don't understand it. I was just looking at our notes, and I've got a sentence which I'm pretty sure Leah said when we were talking about what we're going to talk about, written in the notes, which is that there's so much to struggle with God about, and our only response is prayer. And that, for me, that really sums up the relationship, the fact that in some sense, even though it's not like a relationship with other people that we know, there is this relationship with God. And it's a struggling relationship, and
yeah, I'm totally with you on that, and that's what I really like. You said a similar thing as well, Andy. That prayer is about calling out God and just saying that's not what you're like. So that rebellion sense, I really am with. I think that's a very, very important bit of being human, because the moment you stop doing that. Whether it's praying to God or whether it's saying, I don't accept the situation like it is, I am going to think about a different way. I'm going to hope for a different outcome, even if I don't. Like, that is what being human is all about, that we still expect the good to come toward us.
Yeah.
So that, to me, works on all levels. It's I guess, whenever we get to theorize how that happened, God came and healed this person is also a theory about what happened here. Or God cannot do this is also a theory. Whenever we start doing that, it just gets us into trouble. So in some sense, even if we feel that God has thrown down a star for us and we saw a falling star, or has helped us, find that youth leader, find ourselves really, or has prevented us from we should say, actually, we don't know that was God. Isn't it cool that sometimes this stuff happens, though? The moment we need it? Is it cool that random sometimes works like this too, if God or the world is random? So I maybe we should leave explanations altogether, but then we need to do it on both sides. Yeah. Then we attribute our thanks to God's good world, and we don't say, thank you that you saved me, because sometimes those prayers actually are very mean to those who didn't have that same answer to prayer.
And I think that's part of the reason why I'm so comfortable with complaining, right? Because the alternative is that like extreme Calvinist viewpoint, which essentially says, God's chosen me, I'm valuable, and these people are not valuable, and that's so far from how I can see the world.
Yeah.
When I want to thank, I also then therefore have to complain about the bad things and say this isn't right.
So you can never be thankful.
Well, I can be thankful that allows me to be thankful, right? If when I read the Old Testament, one thing that's quite refreshing about it is they blame God for everything, good and bad, even when it blatantly wasn't God, right? And I like that because it's just obviously wrong, but it's also a way of operating in the world.
Can I read this? It's really good. It's by Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was also writing just after the Second World War and partly in response to the Holocaust. He says, the prophets attributed the injustices they witnessed and the inevitable disaster that would come in its wake to a loss of solidarity with God's concern and care for creation. The initial break in relationship is not between one person and another, but between the people and God. This is the ultimate category of prophetic theology: God's involvement, attentiveness, concern. Prophetic religion may be defined not as what man does with his ultimate concern, but rather what man does with God's concern. The theme of the prophetic understanding is not the mystery of God's essence, but rather the mystery of his relation to man. What the prophet knows about God is his pathos, his relation to Israel and to mankind. The ground of the relation is moral.
Wow. So that means we can even go further into session that we say, God, will you suffer with us as we pray about this war? God, will you actually listen? Are you actually here? Are you actually feeling this?
Yeah.
So we're not just called to call him to action, but also call him to pathos. Wow. Andy, you got to do that in your next prayer.
Yeah. Wow, that would be amazing. I mean I think that's a prayer you can pray with absolute faith that God is already totally committed to suffering with us, right? Cool. I think we better stop. We've got 2 more episodes we're going to do on prayer. We've got a reading. Leah, would you mind? I know you just read something, but would you mind reading the reading that we had?
Yeah. So it was from Ephesians chapter 3, verses 14 to 21. For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth derives his name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints which is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen.
Oh, I want to rebel again.
So the part that you picked out of that, Leah, was the knowing the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, and the contradiction in that.
Yeah. But it just is a conversation that you cannot put to rest.
Yeah.
It's a hard one for me.
So I'm going to stop us. So, listener, we've completely covered and sorted out the topic of can God do stuff in the world?
Yes.
So that's sorted for you. And we think we're going to take a couple more episodes to talk about topic. The next one we're going to do is going to be about something to do with spiritual warfare and the effects of our prayers in the spiritual world. And then we're going to do an episode about essentially what does this mean for me, or what should we actually be doing, how should we be praying, more kind of practical stuff. So I hope you enjoyed it, and there's more to come, and we'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on the chaos that was this episode. Do get in touch, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Told you.